Hello and welcome. My name is Lynna, and you are listening to the Bible, Your Biography podcast. This podcast is devoted to understanding Scripture as a psychological and spiritual revelation of consciousness, as taught by Neville Goddard. Here, the Bible is not approached as history, doctrine, or external religion. It is approached as the story of you. It is your biography. In this episode, we're going to focus specifically on the Old Testament, and more precisely on the names of the books themselves, not as titles of historical writings, but as symbolic indicators of states of consciousness. Because nothing in Scripture is arbitrary. It is not a story of true historical events. It is psychological in nature, to be understood and revealed in time to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. The sequence of the Old Testament is intentional. The names are meaningful. And together, they reveal the structure of unawakened consciousness moving toward recognition. The Old Testament does not describe awakening in its fulfillment. It is an adumbration. It describes the formation, the instability, the conditioning, and refinement of identity before awakening occurs. In the New Testament, the Old Testament is the psychological groundwork. It is the story of consciousness before realization. It is the movement of awareness identifying with states of consciousness, believing them to be self, and experiencing the consequences of that identification. It shows how identity is formed in the book of Genesis, how it becomes conditioned, how it destabilizes, how it searches for Scripture, and finally how it repeats patterns. This is not a story of failure. It is a necessary stage. Before awakening, identity must first be constructed, experienced, and seen. The Old Testament is that process, and the names of its books describe this progression with precision. Genesis means beginning. This is the beginning of identification. Consciousness enters a state and assumes this state as self. I am this. This is where identity is formed, not permanently, but experientially. Genesis is not a one-time event. It happens every time a new state is assumed. Every belief, every identity, every self-concept begins here. Exodus means departure. This represents the moment when a state begins to feel restricted. There is pressure, discomfort, a sense that the current identity no longer fits. Exodus is the breaking point of identification. It is not chosen from clarity. It is often forced through experience. Consciousness begins to move out of what it once accepted as self. Leviticus represents law, order, and structure. This is where consciousness begins to establish rules, conditions for what is accepted, conditions for what is not. Psychologically, this is conditioning, the formation of internal systems that define behavior, perception, and response. This is where identity becomes more rigid, more defined, but still unconscious, unawakened. The book of Numbers represents cycles, counting, and wondering. This is the stage of instability. Identity is not fixed, but it is also not consciously directed. So consciousness moves in loops, repeating reactions, repeating assumptions, repeating outcomes. This is the wondering state, where patterns persist because they are not yet seen. Now, as we move through these books of the Bible, it may help to consider your own life and the states of consciousness that you have moved through, either knowingly or unknowingly. See if you can correlate your life with these meanings and symbolic representations in the books of the Bible. Deuteronomy means repetition of the law. This is where patterns become more visible. The same lessons appear again. The same experiences repeat. Not randomly, but structurally. Consciousness is being shown itself. This is the beginning of recognition, but not yet change. Joshua. This is initial stabilization. Joshua represents entering a new state of consciousness. For the first time, there is direction. Consciousness begins to occupy a new identity with intention. This is not full stability, but it is movement toward it. A state is no longer accidental. It is being chosen. Judges is the oscillation between states. Judges represents cycles of regression and correction. Even after entering a new state, old patterns reappear. There is movement forward, then backward, clarity, then confusion. This oscillation is natural. Identity has not yet stabilized, so consciousness moves between levels. Then we have Ruth. This is loyalty to a new state. Ruth represents devotion and loyalty. This is the beginning of commitment to a new identity. Not forced discipline, but chosen alignment. Consciousness begins to remain with a state, even when it is not yet fully natural. This is a significant shift. Samuel is listening and inner recognition. Samuel represents hearing or listening. This is where consciousness begins to perceive inwardly. There is sensitivity to something deeper. Not external instruction, but internal awareness. This marks the beginning of intuitive recognition. The Book of Kings represents authority and rulership. This is where identity begins to stabilize in power. Consciousness recognizes its role as the one who assumes. There is a sense of dominion, not over others, but over self. However, this authority is not yet absolute. It can still be lost. Chronicles represents review, and remembrance. This is awareness. It is reflection. Consciousness looks back and begins to see patterns more clearly. This is where understanding deepens. Experience is no longer random. It is seen as structured. In Ezra and Nehemiah, this is where we rebuild identity. Ezra and Nehemiah represent reconstruction. After instability and fragmentation, identity begins to rebuild, but now with awareness. This is not unconscious formation. It is conscious restructuring. Esther represents hidden identity. The deeper self is present, but not yet fully revealed. There is protection, timing, a sense that something is unfolding beneath the surface. Job is the collapse of assumption. Job represents the testing of identity. Everything that was assumed to be stable is challenged. This is not punishment, it is exposure. False assumptions are brought to the surface, and they collapse. This is one of the most important stages. Psalms is inner experience and feeling. Psalms represents inner dialogue and emotional processing. This is where consciousness begins to recognize the role of feeling. The internal state becomes visible. This aligns directly with Neville's teaching. Feeling is the secret. Proverbs is structural understanding. Proverbs represents wisdom and pattern recognition. Consciousness begins to understand how experience is formed. There is clarity around cause and effect. This is intellectual alignment, but not yet full realization. Ecclesiastes is detachment from meaning. Ecclesiastes represents the emptiness of external meaning. Everything that once seemed important begins to lose significance. This is not depression, it is detachment. Consciousness is no longer fulfilled by external identification. Song of Solomon is union, the merging of awareness and identity, a deep internal alignment, not yet fully awakening, but movement toward it. The prophets represent inner revelation and disruption. They disrupt false identity. They expose illusion. They call consciousness to a higher recognition. This is not prediction. It is confrontation and preparation. When seen together, the Old Testament reveals a precise psychological movement: beginning, departure, conditioning, instability, repetition, entry, oscillation, commitment, listening, authority, reflection, rebuilding, hidden identity, collapse, feeling, understanding, detachment, union, and revelation. This is the formation of identity, not its completion. This changes how you read Scripture when you truly begin to understand. You're not reading about a distant past. You're recognizing a current process. You can locate yourself within this pattern. not intellectually, but experientially. And as you begin to see this, the Bible becomes immediate. So again, the Old Testament is not a record of events. It is a map of consciousness before awakening. It is an adumbration of what is to occur in the New Testament. The names of the books are not labels, they're markers, and they describe the structure of identity as it forms, destabilizes, and prepares for recognition. Sit with this in your own time. Let the pattern become clear through observation, not effort. Thank you for sharing this space with me. If this brought any clarity, you're welcome to explore more through the Bible, Your Biography website at thebibleyourbiography.com. You may also be interested in listening to Neville Goddard's lectures. You can find those here on YouTube at the Neville Goddard Lectures, or you can visit the website. If you would like to know more about myself and dive deeper into Neville's teachings, you may visit my website at LynnaKTeer.com or my YouTube channel at LynnaKTeer. So again, with the Bible, it is not something you learn. It is something you begin to recognize within yourself at a given point on your own spiritual awakening journey. In future episodes and on the blog, I will be diving deeper into each individual book, each individual character within the Bible, each place, each event, every number, and every pattern. So again, thank you for joining me for today's episode, and I will see you in the next episode, where I will be reviewing the books of the New Testament as they correlate to states of consciousness. Bye now.